But there was once a time when evil lurked in this beautiful place, when people entrenched themselves behind thick walls, always with a watchful eye on the sea. For this was the pirates' hunting ground. They ruled these waters through the 17th and 18th centuries. Merciless and deadly, they turned the Caribbean into a vast battlefield. Day after day, the pirates struck fear into the hearts of seafarers. And then, one day, everything changed. Our story begins in Jamaica. The Arawak Indians called it the land of wood and water. Columbus called it the most beautiful land he had ever seen. Today, the Blue Mountain Island is a thriving center of agriculture and tourism. But back in 1655, when England conquered it, seizing it from Spain, Jamaica became the site of an international conflict, a battle for the riches of the New World. It all began when the island's British governor D'Oyly, under siege from the Spanish, made a pact with the devil. D'Oyly knew that pirates prowled near Hispaniola, today's Haiti, plundering Spanish galleons. And so he invited the pirates, the so-called Brethren of the Coast, to use his island, Jamaica, to launch raids against their common enemy, the Spanish. The Buccaneers' base of operations was a small island harbor, Port Royal. Here, the pirate flag flew high. And soon, the tiny town was transformed into something much more. The richest city in the Western Hemisphere, and the most dissolute as well. A town overrun with money and loose morals. Port Royal will become known as the wickedest city in Christendom. Architect Oliver Cox has studied Port Royal for years, building by building, street by street.
Like any town, port town, it contained a tremendous mixture of population. It had hundreds of taverns and bars and brothels. It had 2 prisons. It had several churches, a synagogue, as well as all of the military and naval men.
It was said, in fact, that there was 1 bar or brothel for every 10 men in Port Royal. The taverns built then flourished with all the pirate gold that flowed through their doors.
They said the main street of Port Royal was richer than Cheapside. Now that was the main trading street in the center of the city of London at the time.
And most of those riches were due to just one thing: Jamaica's favorable location, for the island was situated in the heart of the Spanish trading route. Ships traveling from South America to Spain put in at Havana first, and they all passed right by Jamaica, by the Buccaneers of Port Royal. The ships from Cartagena were always full of treasure. Once the harbor of Columbus, Cartagena was the pearl of colonial America. It was the treasure chest of the New World, the central shipping point through which the Spanish transferred all the plundered wealth of the conquistadors. No other city was such a magnet for adventurers, seafarers, and soldiers of fortune. The treasures came from all across conquered South America. Emeralds, gold, silver, jewels, indescribable wealth. In Cartagena, the treasure was well protected. But just beyond the fortified walls, the trouble began. For the voyage back to Spain was long and perilous, and on the way, only the harbor of Havana offered protection. Here, the fortified walls and heavy cannons of El Morro stood guard. But all around lurked danger. Pirates. The flag of the buccaneers could be seen clear across the Caribbean. Because of the ever-present menace, the islands of the Caribbean were heavily fortified. Even now, the battlements loom above them like eagles' nests. Thick walls testified to the relentless clashes. And they were not only against the buccaneers, for here, far from home, all the old European nations, England, France, Holland, and Spain, all were engaged in a struggle for power, a struggle to capture the incredible wealth of the Americas. The islands served as fortresses from which to wage war. The naval battles around them were long and fierce, and many great ships were sent to the bottom of the sea. And so, we set out on the trail of the past, on the trail of the richly laden boats that were sunk all those years ago. For centuries, the debris from the naval battles, the wreckage of pirate attacks, has been lying in the depths of the Caribbean. All around the islands of the West Indies, scattered on the seabed, are the bits and pieces which have survived the years. A cannon. A chest. Ship's planks. These are the remnants of the great galleons, the remains of once proud ships from long ago, today guarded only by the fish. Cannonballs brought these and so many other ships to an untimely demise, the vicious handiwork of the pirates. Bartholomeus, Rock, Blackbeard, these are the buccaneers who ravaged the Caribbean, and it was men like this who made Port Royal rich.
And the pirates said, if you give us permission, we will capture only the French and the Spanish ships, so long as we can use your harbour. And from that moment, from 1655 to 1690, the city grew at a faster rate than any new towns built since the last war, at a huge rate. And it became from nothing to a city of 1,000 people.
Of all the pirates, it is mainly the infamous Henry Morgan who became synonymous with Port Royal. After each of his notorious raids, he always returned to the harbor. Historian Roderick Ebanks recalls Morgan's impact on the city.
Morgan was one of the best-known pirates, buccaneers in his time. He seems to have been a man who had a lot of leadership ability, and so he was able to organize the largest number of pirates who operated from Port Royal. He was a very brutal, very violent man who used terrorism to frighten the Spanish, and he brought millions of dollars worth of bullion and silver and gold into Port Royal. This money financed trading activities, and it also helped to finance the slave system that was set up in Jamaica.
Amazingly enough, Henry Morgan was knighted and made lieutenant governor of the island in 1672. The town became a trading center to rival even Britain. These were the best of times for Port Royal. The money flowed through Port Royal like water through a sieve.
They have a saying in Jamaica, easy come, easy go. So the pirates would come in with a lot of money and they would spend it in the taverns and the brothels, they would gamble it out.
But then, one day, everything changed. On June 7th, 1692, tragedy struck, and the city trembled when a terrible earthquake shook the island, and the seas rose up. In one terrible instant, the force of nature descended upon this dissolute city like the wrath of God. One eyewitness, the priest Emmanuel Heath, described the events. I found the ground rolling and moving under my feet. I saw the earth open and swallow up a multitude of people, and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortifications. A city which minutes before had been pulsating with life simply disappeared, devoured by the sea. The fortifications built against foreign enemies were no use against the greater foe, nature. Before the earthquake, Port Royal covered an area of 60 acres. After the catastrophe, less than half, only 25 acres, remained. Port Royal was now cut off from the mainland. The wounds inflicted upon Port Royal by the earthquake have yet to heal. It is now only a shadow of its former self. The old Port Royal, a sunken city. Even the old cemetery with the grave of Henry Morgan was swallowed up by the sea. A new cemetery had to be established to bury all the dead, crushed under collapsed walls or washed up by the sea. In all, 2,000 people died, almost the entire population. Only a few buildings survived the quake. Their walls are still standing today, but life departed long ago. They stand as memorials, as warning signs. Fort Charles, too, lingers like a ghost town. Empty and silent, its walls and cannons are a sad relic. Testaments to a terrible time when the richest city in the Western Hemisphere was suddenly transformed into a city of the dead. A city swallowed up and lost under the waves.
The sunken city begins about 400 yards down the coast, and it gradually angles out until it reaches that beacon. Then from the beacon it comes across to the Coast Guard facility to Chocolate Hall, the present parade ground. So all of this is Sunken City. All of this is that part that has never ever been reclaimed.
The sunken city. We want to see it, a metropolis buried beneath the waves. For it was not only walls and buildings that were devoured by the sea in 1692, but unimaginable riches. The gold and silver of one of the wealthiest cities in the world, as Michael Cox confirms.
There is, under the water here, a hidden treasure, you're right. There is also a treasure under the lower parts of the land, which has been subsequently filled up. And so the treasure is not for treasure seekers and not easy for them to find. And the government of Jamaica try and make sure that treasure seekers don't come diving there.
The temptations of the sunken city are great. But right behind any would-be treasure hunters is the Coast Guard. They follow our boat out into the harbor. Not for one moment do they let us out of their sight. Exaggerated precautions? Not really. Already, too many treasures have disappeared, snatched up by illegal diving expeditions. Only with the Coast Guard's agreement, only with their accompaniment, will they let us dive at all.
Ready? Okay.
Below the surface, visibility is limited to a few yards. The first thing discernible on the seabeds are the traps left by island fishermen. But there is no gold shimmering in these cages, just a few fat moray eels. The more we look, the more we realize there are no streets awaiting us down here, no walls or sculptures, only layers of mud and sand. The sunken city, you have to imagine it. It lies buried under 3 centuries of debris. In the past few decades, several teams of archaeologists have searched the seabed here. Their handiwork is in place, strings that mark the outlines of buildings and streets. But it's a hard task. To uncover the old Port Royal, they have to make their way through thick layers of silt and coral, only to find that days later, their work was in vain. Still, there have been successes. In the 1960s, 2 large caches of Spanish silver coins were reportedly found here. And everyone who has had any dealings with Port Royal is certain of one thing. There are many more treasures to be discovered in the sunken city. For here in the sand lies gold, the dream of every treasure hunter. Yet, what the archaeologists have uncovered is mostly the traces of pirate life. So far, The greatest finds have been mere fragments. In Port Royal's museum, the old military hospital, lie the treasures, priceless pieces of the past. Some are the rich goods of trade ships, some the actual personal possessions of pirates, revealing the way they lived.
We have here also a baluster. They tend to come in varying sizes, and they're all pewter again, and this was used as large as a decanter for pouring wine. The wine usually are stored in onion bottles. Again, the onion bottles were of varying sizes, but they were largely of this size. From the number of onion bottles retrieved, gives us an idea of the extent to which alcohol was consumed in Port Royal pre-1692.
The archaeologists have salvaged Indian handicrafts, fine Chinese porcelain, English bowls, the keys to a culture frozen in time. Perhaps the most intriguing treasure is not to be found among the exhibits of the museum, but in a small church nearby. The silver service of the top pirate of all, Henry Morgan.
This was a microcosm of the mixture of different ethnic origins, Indian, Afro-American, African slaves, and the Americas too coming over. They were all mixed together, living cheek by jowl. And of course, having to live together in that way was totally different from any other part of the plantation lands, where the blacks were in one little slave quarter and the rich plantation owners had great castles to themselves.
Welcome to Jamaica, where the rum come from. The rum come from, where the rum come from. Welcome to Jamaica, where the rum come from. Relax and have some fun.
Today, Port Royal is a quiet little town, easygoing, laid back. The inhabitants have their share of contemporary problems and graces. But modern as they are, the people here still appreciate their island's remarkable history, its extraordinary past. For strange as it may seem in today's world, they are the heirs of a unique heritage. And in many ways, that heritage is still alive. Here, they still tell tales of the days when pirates roamed these streets, still boast on the waterfront of the buccaneer legends. And in this little harbor by the waters of the Caribbean, the archaeologists and inhabitants have an ambitious aim: to take a corner of the 20th century and breathe life once again into old Port Royal, to uncover the entire city beneath the waves and transform it into an underwater museum, the first of its kind, to recreate the city of the pirates, the city of ancient lore. Robert Stevens is involved in the planning.
One of the most important aspects of this project is that we're developing this for Jamaicans. And because it is going to be so fantastic, we would like to share it with foreign visitors who come to Jamaica. And this whole concept is going to give a lot of people more pride in ensuring that the attractions are properly maintained, properly managed. And we're going to create an entire park area out at Port Royal, a protected area for the environment of Port Royal.
To fuse the present and the past, that is the dream. But as the modern wrecks and sunken ships on the coastline of Jamaica attest, What happened then in Port Royal can happen again any time. The whims of nature are still as dangerous as ever, still capricious, still taking their toll. Nevertheless, the treasure hunt goes on. The archaeologists toil against silt and sand, against storms and hurricanes, and they dream of the day when the houses on land are restored, the city underwater uncovered. Will it come to pass? Who can say? But this is the dream. For now, a lethargic calm pervades the remains of the once so rich and riotous city. There is a legend that, on a clear day, the sunken treasure of Port Royal can be seen glittering in the water. Day by day, as the fishermen glide out over the waves, beneath them slumbers the sunken city.
On a beach in the East Mediterranean, not far from Haifa, lie the colossal ruins of a once great city. 3,000 years ago, the city of Dor boasted massive stone-built battlements and a finely equipped harbor. It was a citadel of the Sea Peoples, a name the ancient Egyptians gave to several groups, including the Phoenicians, who were eventually crushed by the Israelites under King David. For 12 seasons, an international team has excavated the massive ruins here. On August the 13th, 1992, University of California archaeologist Andrew Stewart was just about to wind up another season at the dig. One more day of hurried recording and cleanup was left. And then the unexpected happened.
And Ranveer, the square supervisor, came over to me after about half an hour and said, Andy, it was about that rubble that you asked us to dig. And I said, yeah. He said, we got rid of it yet? He said, actually, we got rid of most of it, but there's a foot sticking out of it, and it's human.
For the next 11 hours, the team raced to uncover the skeleton pinned under the rubble. As the bones emerged, so did the clues. The pelvis was broad, and so could only have belonged to a woman. The excavators judged that she was in her 30s. Her body was contorted, and her arms were raised up as if to protect herself. But the effort had been in vain. Ephraim Stern, who has worked at Dor for 21 years, believes the woman was a casualty of King David's attack on the city around 1000 BC.
The Phoenician city had been captured by the Israelites during the beginning of the 10th century by the armies of David. So she was killed when the city had been captured by the army, by the soldiers, and her body, like the body of many other people, have been left where she was killed and exactly where we found her.
But Stern's collaborator, Andrew Stewart, disagrees. He thinks the woman was killed by a collapsing stone wall.
Nothing that we found as we were digging her suggested to us that human violence was in any way involved. There was no knife sticking into her body or anything like that. But more importantly, everything that we found was consistent with almost a split-second accident. It didn't seem to us at all that she had been, say, murdered, then somebody pushed a wall over on her. It looked to me as though it was a single event which contorted and crushed her.
Stewart's view was tested when the bones were examined at the Hebrew University Medical School. Anthropologist Patricia Smith found no cut marks such as might have been inflicted by a knife or a sword. The bones were smashed into many fragments.
The question was, could I find any evidence on the skeleton to determine how this individual died? Well, as you can see, most of the bones are fragmented, but if we look here especially, we can see here and here this spiral fracture that I was talking about, and if you look very carefully, you can see that there's a raised edge here. This is the sort of fracture that only occurs in fresh bone. This particular break definitely occurred either when she was still alive or immediately after she died.
Buried among the ruins of her pantry for 3,000 years, the crushed and twisted remains of a young woman seem to confirm the biblical account of David's conquest of the Phoenicians. Or perhaps they tell of a greater conflict, the shifting of massive plates beneath the Earth's crust.
I think what happened, judging by the rocks that we found on her, was that the wall began to fall, for whatever reason. She turned around to flee, and it caught her as she was turning around. And a rock seems to have hit her in the pelvis, another in the rib cage, and a third on the head. And when she turned, her foot twisted and broke.
As she fell to the floor, broken potsherds and animal bones sliced into her body. The impact of the stones broke her neck and shattered her skull. But what caused the stones to fall? The earthquake possibility has been pursued by earth scientist Amos Nur. He thinks there's good evidence that at least 9 other sites in northern Israel suffered severe damage around 1000 BC, the date of Dor's destruction. His quest for clues about ancient earthquakes took on a dramatic new meaning one day in October 1989.
For many years I studied earthquakes as a theoretical thing, like many scientists do. Until the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in California. I was in my office at Stanford University, and my office completely collapsed during the earthquakes. I dove under my desk just a split second before my huge steel bookcase came down. It was that experience in 1989 that transformed me from an earthquake theoretician to a practitioner. And I decided I really want to understand this, the human aspect of past earthquakes, not just the theory.
The 1989 quake killed 67 people. 1 year earlier, a quake in Armenia killed as many as 25,000 people. Though we understand earthquakes better than in Old Testament times, they are still as lethal. Geologists tell us that some places are predisposed to earthquakes, and their occurrence is as inevitable as it is unpredictable. This was the scene in Jerusalem in 1927, when an earthquake only slightly weaker than those in California and Armenia struck. The threat lies in the 2 great fault systems that cut across the Holy Land. One runs north-south. Along it lie the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan, and the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea itself was created when 2 giant pieces of the Earth's crust split and spread apart along what is known as the Asia-Africa Rift. At 400 meters below sea level, it is the lowest point on the Earth's surface. A smaller fault follows the mountains known as the Mount Carmel Ridge and runs into the Mediterranean just north of Dor. Earthquakes occur as the plates on each side of the fault periodically slip, tear, and grind against each other, producing some of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded. Earth scientists seek to find a pattern in these violent events. To learn what clues an earthquake leaves behind, Nur studied the Hellenistic and Roman ruins at Beit Shan. A well-documented quake struck here in 749 AD, leaving a dramatic tableau of devastation.
For earthquakes and archaeology, Beit Shan is truly unique because we know that an earthquake happened here and we see its effects. For example, here we see a cracked column that collapsed here. Here is another stone layer, and altogether they were the facade of this temple, which must have risen to about 50 feet right above the street. And during the earthquake, all the structure fell into this main street of Beit Shan, as you see it right here. We see many other things, more subtle. Buckled street. We see, for example, the staircase here that got completely distorted and tilted by this earthquake. We see here the separation between the blocks and the stairs, and here, and the slippage between these blocks. due to this earthquake here. The importance of this evidence is that it gives us a calibration for effects in places where we don't know that an earthquake has happened.
But proving that earthquakes happened isn't always easy. These are the ruins of Megiddo, a city that lies at a crucial gap in the Mount Carmel Ridge. For thousands of years, traders and armies have sought this pass through the mountains. It has witnessed dozens of bloody battles, including the crushing defeat of the Turks by British forces under General Allenby in 1918. But long ago, Megiddo apparently suffered another kind of destruction. And its name, translated by the Greeks into Armageddon, became synonymous with the ultimate cataclysm. Its apocalyptic end is familiar to us from the book of Revelation. And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake such as was not seen since men were upon the earth. So mighty an earthquake, and so great. Was Armageddon inspired by a real event? Though the ancient city of Megiddo was located at a strategically vital pass through the mountains, its position was vulnerable. Megiddo's inhabitants, who left layer after layer of refuse here beginning 8,000 years ago, may have learned to live with disaster. Famed Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin dug here in 1960 and found many bones crushed under mud brick walls. The date of the disaster was about the same as the one at Dor, 1000 BC. Yadin blamed the damage on King David's attack on the site, even though the Bible does not list Megiddo among his conquests. Nur thinks his own explanation is more plausible. Because Megiddo sits right on top of the Mount Carmel fault and is only 30 miles from the bigger Dead Sea fault, he believes a giant earthquake struck Megiddo and inspired the biblical prophecy of Armageddon.
The reason I think that Armageddon is associated with earthquakes, besides the fact that it's sitting on an active fault, in fact, we know there are earthquakes here. We know there were earthquakes here, so this place was shaken many times. And if you look at the construction, or like the wall behind me, this is very poor anti-seismic construction. In the book of Revelation, the description is of a huge battle, which will be accompanied by an enormous earthquake, such a one that has never happened. The earthquake will crack the city into 3 parts. It will make the mountains disappear. It will make the ocean recede. The movement of the ocean is a tsunami. We know it from any earthquake. The cracking of the city into parts is just the typical collapse of these cities. Somehow they have an extremely precise description of an earthquake to happen in the future.
Yet another site in northern Israel has yielded signs of earthquakes. The great mound of Hatzor lies a few miles from the Sea of Galilee. More than 3,000 years ago, it was an important cult center of the Canaanites. Later, under the reign of King Solomon, the city became a key strategic center for the Israelites. Amnon ben Tor has dug here for the last 4 years.
Most of what you can see today on the Acropolis of Hatzor, where we are, dates to the Israelite period. It starts with the 10th century, not the city, but the monument that I'm referring to, the gate just behind us and the city wall, attributed to the 10th century to King Solomon. It is mentioned in the Book of Kings that Solomon built Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, 3 large sites in the country, and most probably this is indeed of the days of King Solomon. Well, we can tell by the pottery that it is of the 10th century. So this is one important monument.
Yigal Yadin also dug at Hatzor in the 1960s. Though he seems to have ignored the possibility of earthquake damage at Megiddo, the idea suddenly took hold of him at Hatzor. The crucial evidence came from Stratum 6.
Stratum 6, according to Yadin, was destroyed sometime towards the middle of the 8th century by an earthquake referred to in the biblical narrative, the famous earthquake in the time of Amos. And archaeological evidence for that, according to Yadin, is that many of the walls which he found are tilted, and this, according to Yadin, cannot be explained by any human destruction, any human causes. Only nature could create such a destruction, hence earthquake.
Yadin linked the tilted walls he'd uncovered to an earthquake mentioned in 2 Old Testament books, Amos and Zechariah. Most biblical scholars put the date at around 760 BC.
In Chatzor, for example, we have a beautiful case of destruction by an earthquake. It's beautiful because in the site itself, there is tremendous evidence for collapse of a building and broken parts and so on. And we also have a biblical description of the same earthquake. It happens during Uzziah's time in about 750 BCE, and presumably devastated the entire country.
It is perhaps too easy to attribute a city's destruction to an earthquake. Over the millennia, buildings fall, ground shifts, battles are fought. Hatzor's tilted walls could have any number of explanations.
Indeed, there are many walls which are tilted at Chatzor. There may be other causes, the topography, the slope. I don't know if anyone would ever be able to be positive about the cause of destruction here. So for the time being, it's a nice story, it's a nice interpretation, it's a nice possibility, but to say that we are 100% certain, I don't think we can.
The terror of earthquakes is synonymous with destruction and death. But in one of the most familiar yet curious of all Old Testament stories, an earthquake may be considered a miracle. The saga of Joshua recounts how his soldiers blew on their trumpets and caused the walls of Jericho to come tumbling down. One thing is certain. A great walled city did stand here, at an important crossroads just north of the Dead Sea. Excavations in the 1930s and 1950s revealed Jericho to be one of the oldest cities in the world. Around 6000 BC, they fortified Jericho with tremendously strong walls. On the west side was a round stone tower no less than 23 feet high. The Jericho that Joshua's army may have confronted belongs to a later era, around 1400 BC. Here, archaeologists have also found evidence of huge defensive walls and the victims of a violent disaster.
The skeletons that were found in Jericho were crushed. They weren't just buried or put in the ground. They were crushed with broken limbs, and one of them had a huge stones right on top of it. To us, it implies that some big collapse was involved in killing these 2 people. Aside from skeletons, jars with grain were found in Jericho and other foodstuff that was also covered by rubble. And it probably means that it wasn't an attack of an army, it was some kind of catastrophe that buried these foodstuff, and that's where they stayed.
Noah thinks an earthquake can explain another puzzling element in the Joshua story.
During the 1927 earthquake, or because of it, the Jordan River stopped flowing because of slumps into the river from the banks of the river. The same thing happened many times before, as we know from historical records. And the remarkable thing is in the description of Joshua's conquest of Jericho, there's also a description how the Jordan River went dry and the Israelites crossed it while it wasn't flowing. The stories and the events are so similar to what we have seen in 1927 and other earthquakes, it makes it a very compelling case that an earthquake was involved in the collapse of the walls of Jericho and the conquest of the city by Joshua and his army.
Archaeologists such as Amnon Ben-Tor are cautious about taking the Bible too literally.
Because a lot of what you read in the Bible is in itself in interpretation of somebody who interpreted events that happened before his time. So the question is, what do you take as evidence? Okay, this is the question. Once we agreed on this, definitely the Bible should be used, must be used to illustrate, to corroborate, to fill in gaps. The same thing goes also for archaeology. Archaeology can give meaning, can fill in gaps in our understanding and so on. So it goes both ways. Archaeology and the Bible have to be linked.
As far as Noah is concerned, his quest for the truth behind stories such as Joshua and Sodom and Gomorrah is more than mere academic curiosity.
What we hope to get out of the study of historical earthquakes and the archaeological evidence is to get an idea about the time-space pattern of large or moderate earthquakes. And in order to do that, we have to go to places where we have very long historical record. This is the best place to do so. Hopefully in the future we're going to get some idea of whether there is a precise repeat time or some other pattern in earthquake which could help us tremendously in figuring out how to predict earthquakes in the future. We want to use the past to predict the future, if possible.
By tracking the incidence of earthquakes in the Middle East, Noah hopes to arrive at a means for predicting future quakes. His study of ancient catastrophe may alert us to the role of earthquakes in the Holy Land and help prepare us for the inevitable shocks to come.
In every age, the threat of earthquakes has aroused a special, chilling fear. Modern science helps us to understand the forces deep within the earth that give rise to these terrifying events, even if the goal of prediction remains elusive. But how much more frightening it must have been then for the people of Dor or Megiddo or Jericho when their world suddenly collapsed around them. Little wonder such catastrophes were attributed to the vengeance of God and passed into the realm of biblical legend.
Day after day, the pirates struck fear into the hearts of seafarers. And then, one day, everything changed. Our story begins in Jamaica. The Arawak Indians called it the land of wood and water. Columbus called it the most beautiful land he had ever seen. Today, the Blue Mountain Island is a thriving center of agriculture and tourism. But back in 1655, when England conquered it, seizing it from Spain, Jamaica became the site of an international conflict, a battle for the riches of the New World. Built then flourished with all the pirate gold that flowed through their doors.
They said the main street of Port Royal was richer than Cheapside. Now that was the main trading street in the centre of the city of London at the time.
And most of those riches were due to just one thing: Jamaica's favorable location. For the island was situated in the heart of the Spanish trading route. Ships traveling from South America to Spain put in at Havana first, and they all passed right by Jamaica, by the buccaneers of Port Royal. The ships from Cartagena were always full of treasure. Once, it all began when the island's British governor D'Oyly, under siege from the Spanish, made a pact with the devil. D'Oyly knew that pirates prowled near Hispaniola, today's Haiti, plundering Spanish galleons. And so he invited the pirates, the so-called Brethren of the Coast, to use his island, Jamaica, to launch raids against their common enemy, the Spanish. The Buccaneers' base of operations was a small island harbor, Port Royal. Here, the pirate flag flew high. And soon, the tiny town was transformed into something much more. The richest city in the Western Hemisphere, and the most dissolute as well. But there was once a time when evil lurked in this beautiful place. When people entrenched themselves behind thick walls, always with a watchful eye on the sea. For this was the pirates' hunting ground. They ruled these waters through the 17th and 18th centuries. Merciless and deadly, they turned the Caribbean into a vast battlefield. A town overrun with money and loose morals. Port Royal would become known as the wickedest city in Christendom. Architect Oliver Cox has studied Port Royal for years, building by building, street by street.
Like any town, port town, it contained a tremendous mixture population. It had hundreds of taverns and baths and brothels. It had 2 prisons. It had several churches, a synagogue, as well as all of the military and naval men.
It was said, in fact, that there was 1 bar or brothel for every 10 men in Port Royal. The tavern